Today we turn our attention to John chapter 4. And here what we find is a truly cross-cultural encounter. Now, in chapter 3, Jesus had made it clear that God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish. So the gospel, even as far as back as the prologue, where John said, he came to his own, but his own did not receive him, but to all who did receive him, right? And so the gospel was always intended for everyone. And here we see such a vivid display of that truth as Jesus speaks with a Samaritan, not just that, but a woman, not just that, but a woman who has a bit of what some people would call a scandalous life. Okay, so here we see the overreaching love of God for the world and for individuals as he brings the gospel. But now let's first talk about the Samaritans. Okay? The Samaritans. This is a picture of a modern procession on Mount Gerizim in near the village of Shechem in Israel today. The Samaritans still exist as a sect, and they still have worship practices. But where are they from historically, and why is there such animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans? Well, if we go back to 2 Kings chapter 17, we see the beginnings of syncretism in Samaritan worship. Okay, Samaria was the high place. It begins even before that, though, doesn't it? But we have scattered throughout the book of Kings, we have this references to synchronistic worship. That is, taking one religion, blending it with another, and passing it off as the true religion. But actually, doesn't that start already back with Moses and Aaron and the golden calf? He builds a golden calf and says, "Tomorrow we'll have a festival to the Lord." But at any rate, we know that judgment came upon the northern tribes through the Assyrian Empire, and they were deported. By and large, you see here the Assyrian Empire in the 9th century BC, right? And just let me get my laser pointer here, right here in the 9th century BC. And then the resettlement, as was the practice of many of those Near Eastern empires, they take all the good people out. And we see that especially later with Babylon, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach. They take all the brightest and best and the wealthy and the influential, and then they use the vacated area as their dumping ground. And so there was the poor and the old and the elderly left in the northern tribes, and then all of a sudden we have an infiltration of other people, and they start to mix their blood, which, of course, the law of Moses had forbidden. Worse yet, they began to mix their religious practices and just make it kind of a quasi-free-for-all, right? I have to turn my pen off here. Okay. Now, this is modern Shechem. It sits in the valley in roughly the middle of the land in Israel. It was the earliest site of religion when Joshua led the people into the Holy Land. It was situated between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. Moses, in Deuteronomy 11, had given the instructions that when you get there, we want representatives from half the tribes to go up on Mount Gerizim and half on Mount Ebal, and the people gather in the valley below, and they would read the section from Deuteronomy the later chapters that spoke of blessings and curses. So Mount Gerizim, if we want to be simple about it, was the gospel, and Mount Ebal was the law. And they shouted these blessings and curses back and forth as they ratified the covenant. And then Joshua set up a memorial stone at Shechem. Shechem was roughly in the middle of the land, north to south, east to west. It was the site of the first sanctuary. Okay, so way before Jerusalem, Mount Gerizim had religious significance for the people of Israel. Later, of course, though, there developed differences, like I said, largely from this intercultural mixing that took place at the time of the exiles. So, by the time of Jesus, the Samaritans were a notable sect, an offshoot of Judaism. They kind of considered themselves the pure form of Judaism. Of course they did. Okay, they accepted only 5 books of Moses, and actually only their version of the 5 books. There is something called the Samaritan Pentateuch. Their worship took place on Mount Gerizim. They were very, very high on following precise, exact ritual. The leaders were the priests. They believed they were the true Israel. Abraham, of course, was their father. They made the claim that Eli, the priest, at the time of Samuel, illegally took the ark from Shechem to Shiloh. I don't know what the basis of that was, but that was their claim. And then notice, after 200 A.D., the belief in the resurrection and the final judgment. So here's a picture of live slaughter going on, sacrifice on Mount Gerizim at the time of Passover. Modern photo. The Jewish attitudes towards the Samaritans is pretty clear from some of their writings, both the Apocrypha and the rabbinic writings. So this is from Sirach. 2 nations my soul hates, and the third is not even a people. Those that sit upon the mountain of Samaria and dwell among the Philistines, and that foolish people that dwell in Shechem. That was written in 185 BC. Now, of course, Shechem is the same as Shechem, so it's a reference to the Samaritans. Or in the book of Maccabees, not long after this, the king sent an old man of Athens to compel the Jews to depart from the laws of their fathers and to not live after the laws of God, and to pollute also the temple in Jerusalem, and to call it the temple of Jupiter Olympius, and that in Gerizim, that mountain, of Jupiter the defender of strangers, as they did desire that dwelt in that place. So, yeah, this is kind of the archaeological story of Mount Gerizim. The Samaritan temple was, at one time, a full-blown temple to Jupiter. Okay, so it was a holy site to the Samaritans, and then they put the temple to Jupiter on there, defiled the whole place, and then they tore that down and rebuilt it, etc., etc. The Talmud, in the section called Kuthim, when will the Samaritans be received into the Jewish community? When they have renounced Mount Gerizim and acknowledged Jerusalem and the resurrection of the dead. Now, this, of course, plays into this chapter because there's going to be an argument about worship. Where does it take place? On this mountain, and the woman means Mount Gerizim, or in Jerusalem. Okay? So both were vying for being the legitimate place to worship God. And the woman asked about this, and Jesus gave her a very interesting answer. There were other tensions between the Judeans and the Galileans and the Samaritans. Herod had married a Samaritan. Well, then again, Herod had married 10 times. It was, I suppose, just random fate that he eventually would marry a Samaritan. Herod had this propensity to marry women, then put them to death, and then feel really bad about it. and build a tower or building or something in her honor. Now, I think it's an overstatement to say that all Jews avoided going through Samaria. That simply can't be substantiated. There is evidence that some Jews in religious piety or conscience would not travel through Samaria, but others didn't have a problem with it. John Hyrcanus, the Maccabean high priest, destroyed Mount Gerizim in the late 1st century BC. That would have been just before Pompey the Great swept through the area in the 60s BC. And early in Jesus' life, the Samaritans defiled the temple in Jerusalem with dead bones at the start of the Passover. This is about 6 or 7 AD. The incident is recorded by Josephus. So you talk about biological warfare. Of course, dead bones immediately defile a place. And so the Samaritans went on some clandestine mission and sneaked into the temple complex and threw dead bones into the temple and temporarily prevented the Passover from proceeding until it could be properly purified. So, I've said this before, any president of the United States who thinks he's just going to walk in and in 4 years solve the whole Mideast thing, well, he should read a little more history about how long these tensions have existed in that part of the world. What's interesting is that in the time after Jesus, the Samaritans gained the attention of Pontius Pilate, and it ultimately led to his downfall. So, after Jesus had done his work of salvation, a few years later, there appeared in Samaria, at Mount Gerizim, another man claiming to be a messianic figure. And you could almost see Pilate going, oh man, not this again. He claimed to have found the remnants of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, and he would rebuild the tabernacle and usher in the era of divine favor. Well, Pilate just wasn't going to tolerate this a second time, so he went up, used force, killed a bunch of people brutally, and then the Roman governor Vitellius sent him home. Tough to say what happened to Pilate. He passes out of Roman history. There are legends, of course, that he became a Christian, that he went and retired to what we would call a monastery, but that's a little anachronistic to say that. Some say that he was cursed with bad dreams. One account says that he became a habitual hand washer for the rest of his life. But whatever the case, his time in Palestine was done. The Samaritans have their own version of the Torah, and here you see a portion of Leviticus. The script, is basically the Hebrew script, but they have their own translations of certain passages that they consider key. So that's a little background on the Samaritans, and now we come to the account in John chapter 4, the Samaritan woman. I'm going to proceed by taking a chunk of verses and just making some comments on the Greek text and walk you through it. And if there's anything I miss on your study guides, please bring those to class and we can talk about them. Hasun egon ha Jesus hati ekuzan hoi fersaioi hati Jesus plaionas mathetas poiai kai baptizai e Ioannes katoiga Jesus autas uk baptizain al hoi mathataiautu afeken ten Judaean kai ab elthan palin eistain Galilean edai de auton de erkestai dia tes Samarias. So, therefore, when Jesus when he knew or came to understand that the Pharisees heard that Jesus was making poiai right here. Poiai was making pleanos mathetias, more disciples, and was baptizing. It is a present tense, that's true, but John often uses the simple present in a past sense. Now, notice the punctuation here on A. Okay, notice it's not the article. This is a comparison. Well, we were expecting a comparison, weren't we? Because we have a comparison here with pleanos. Okay, the comparative form of Paulus. More disciples than John. Genitive of comparison here, Ioannes. And then kind of a disclaimer. Now, was it written later by some other author? I don't think so. I think it was written at the time of the gospel. But earlier, John had given the impression that Jesus was baptizing by the Jordan. He did that in chapter 3. Okay, katoi ge, but indeed, an adversative, kind of a kai toi, and indeed also, or something like that, but it's an adversative, so, but Jesus himself, here in the nominative, intensive, he was not baptizing, but rather, 180-degree shift, his disciples were baptizing. We have an ellipsis, so baptizo goes without Jesus, and baptizo goes with mathetai. Okay, so when he had learned this, he left. Aphiemi. Okay, he left Judean. He left Judea and he went again into Galilee. And then we come across this very interesting statement right here. It was necessary, here in the imperfect. I'm expecting an infinitive. There it is. The aorist infinitive. It was necessary for him, accusative subject often used with die and the infinitive, to go through Samaria. It was necessary for him to go through Samaria. Okay, but what does that mean? Well, let's take a look. So here you have Sychar, and we don't know actually exactly where Jesus had been baptizing. It was somewhere in here. At the end of chapter 3, we have this little episode where we sense that there's rivalry going on between the disciples of John and the disciples of Jesus. But John gives that beautiful answer, he must become greater, I must become less. Okay, but here, anyway, Sychar, Samaria, by this time the capital city, Shomron, the watchtower, the headquarters of the dynasty of Omri, Ahab, most notably. Okay, Samaria, the capital at the time of the Assyrian deportation in 722. Sychar was close by, okay, just a couple miles away, about maybe not even from here to, well, maybe like from here to Klosner, if you actually know where that is, or here to Searles. I think Cortland might be a little far, but just a couple miles away in the valley, Sychar, where the well was. Okay? Now, Kostenberger has a nice quote here. It was necessary. It may indicate divine necessity. Jesus going through Samaria was according to the plan and will of God. This is a very strong theme in John's Gospel, that Jesus is on a program. He just is not going to do anything. There's no freelancing. There's no making it up as he goes along. He has come to speak his Father's words and to do the works that his Father gave him to do. So, I have no problem just reading a lot of divine intervention, or not divine intervention, but divine direction here in the word edai. He had to. Not in the sense that there was no other alternative. No, but the divine plan to reach out to the world compelled him to do this. Okay? His will was completely in harmony with his Father's will. He wasn't a robot, but he was so in tune with what his Father wanted to do to make himself known to the world that it was necessary for him to go through Samaria. Erkatai, now we're at verse 5, Erkatai un eis palin te Samarias legamene sikar plesion tu korio ha edoken Jacob to Yosef to huio autu. Ende ekai pege tu Jacob, haun Jesus kekoi piaskos, ektes hodoi porias, ekathedzeta hutos epite pege, hora ein hos hekte. Hekte. All right, so therefore he is going, where? He is going eis palin, there's my accusative, to the city. What city? Of Samaria. Okay, we would probably say in Samaria. Or, no, I'm sorry, of the Samaritans, so genitive of possession. Now, what kind of palin is it? It is a legumenane palin. Notice the feminine participle because palin here is feminine. Okay? And it called, just the present middle passive participle there, called Sychar. Now, plesion, adverbial here, nearby, to Koriu, the field, choras. What field? The field which. Remember, relative pronouns are not adjectives. Sometimes they're in the same case as the noun they modify, but like here, it's the subject of the clause. So, near the field, okay, plesion followed by a genitive. Nearby the field, what field? The field which Jacob gave, okay? Well, actually here, I take that back, it's accusative. Neuter accusative. So, and Jacob gave it to Joseph, his son. This whole chunk goes together. Or Jacob, I'm sorry, which Jacob gave to Joseph, the son of his, or to Joseph, his son. Okay? And it was there, or there was there, impersonal, a well of Jacob. Okay, now notice it doesn't say the well of Jacob like the tour guides like to call it today. The well of Jacob, as if it was the only one he dug. It wasn't. Okay, we know that from Genesis. Okay, therefore, Jesus, what kind of Jesus is he? He is a kekapiaskos. You see the perfect participle here. Reduplication, nominative, masculine, singular, ending, modifying Jesus. What kind of Jesus is he? He is having been worn out Jesus. Now, ek is kind of interesting here because it's almost like means, right? Of the hodoi porias, of the road going. We would probably say worn out from the traveling. Okay, but you see hodos, and you see the noun form of the verb poroiomai, which means to go. So hodoi porias, from the travels, it's from the traveling, you could even say. Okay, with all that, what did Jesus do? Jesus, here's my main verb, ekathedzeta. Do you see what tense it is here? Augment, okay, plus secondary ending. Here we have a simple imperfect. He was sitting down, okay, thus, okay, epi, now was he actually like on top of the well, next to, beside? Well, I mean, the wells have these stone borders and they kind of function as seats and resting benches. Okay, so think of it that way. I have a picture of this well in a few slides. You'll get a better visual there. And it was about the 6th hour. Okay, to koriu ha edoken ha Jacob. So you see the word chorus, but it's the diminutive form, right? Like a chorion. And so that's how it ends up being neuter. And that's how it ends up being translated a plot of ground in some Bible translations like the NIV. So koriu, a little field, right? A little patch of ground. So we have the trace of the, what do we call that? The abstract, right? Or the I forget what it's called when you own a house and you have the history of it attached to it. I lost mine for this house, and I need to recover that somehow. The plot? No, that's not the plot. It's the... Yeah, forget it. But anyways, Genesis 33, purchased by Jacob, given to Joseph. And in Joshua, they took the bones of Joseph up from Egypt, and he was eventually buried there. Okay? So there's a strong relation to the Old Testament patriarchs at this particular place. Now, it says that Jesus was completely worn out, tired as he was, because he was tired. What kind of Jesus is he? He is having become tired Jesus. And it's not a passive, perfect passive participle. It is active, having become weary, okay, from the journey. From the trip. He was sitting. Kathedzeta. So here we have a geographic timestamp, or some kind of, not geographic so much as in the, well, it comes over from chapter 3. At the end, we knew that they were near Salim. Or was it near Ainan? But in either case, they had been a day and a half before, they had been in the Jordan Rift Valley. Now, I've shown you a picture of that and the deep gash in the earth that valley creates. Okay, one of the deepest fault lines on the planet, with the bottom of the Dead Sea reaching a depth of 1,800 feet. And the sea level itself is 1,300 feet below sea level. So it's this deep gash. And now they're up in Samaria. And they would have had to climb up out of the valley. Okay, so 40 miles in a day and a half. Okay, if we judge that a standard day's journey in Jesus' day was between... Well, on average, I mean, if you're in good health and were on business, you could make 25 miles a day. You could do that. But we're talking, 40 miles by Roman roads. Anyways, it was a long haul. And so it's no question now here at noon the next day, had they traveled the entire previous day? And you also have to think about what season of the year are we in? Okay, is it warm out? Or is it the cool season? All this plays into the text. The Roman time reference is here indicated about noon, the 6th hour. Okay, the Jewish night, of course, began, or the Jewish day began at 6 p.m. in the evening. So these timestamps become important, especially when we think about the crucifixion of Jesus. And exactly what hours was he on the cross and what time. So, but whatever, it does make a nice picture to the previous chapter where we have a nighttime visit and now we have a daytime visit, the middle of the day. Kind of interesting, a little artistic flair that the Holy Spirit used. Okay, so about the 6th hour is noon. We go on with verse 7. Erkatai gene ektes semaraias ant lesai hydor. Legai aute ha Jesus dos moi pain. Hoi garmathe taiautu ap ele luthaisan. Wow. Oh, don't see too many pluperfects, but there is one right there. They had gone from ap erkomai. They had gone eistain palin hina trophas agorasosen. Legai un auto he gene he samarites pos su judaios on par emu pain aitais ginaikas samaritidos uzes. And then a parenthetical comment, ugar synchrontai judaioi samaritais. Synchrontai, yes. All right, a couple of things we want to note here. Get out the pen. So, erkatai genai, there came a woman. I don't think you have to translate it, she arrived. A lot of times, ein, like there was a man sent from God, his name was John. Okay. Here, ektes of the Samaritans. Okay. She came, and here, another kind of rare infinitive that just expresses purpose. Right? I don't know how else you would take it. We don't have a hina purpose clause, but the meaning is clear. She came to draw water. Okay? And so Jesus said to her, dos. Okay? The present active imperative from didomi. I'm sorry, not the present active, but just the aorist imperative. No reduplication. That's why. It's aorist. Give to me to drink. Okay? And now, almost another parenthetical comment. For his disciples had departed into the city, hina agorazozen, in order to buy food. Okay, now just a word about hina. I noticed this from correcting your tests. If you see a hina, you automatically think subjunctive. Okay, don't think optative. But Professor, we learned that in secondary sequence... Yeah, okay, I know. But this is Koine Greek. It's a little more simplified. There are only 56 optatives in the entire Greek New Testament. And you should just think, if I have a hina, I have a purpose clause, and I have a subjunctive. Okay, that should be your default when you see a hina. Purpose clause, subjunctive. Then it just becomes a question of what tense of the subjunctive is it. Now here is a sigma. Okay, it's not a future subjunctive. There are no future subjunctives. That's an aorist subjunctive. All right? Those are really going to be your only... For all practical purposes, your only two options. It's either going to be a present or an aorist subjunctive. I mean, it's just incredibly rare that we'd have a perfect subjunctive. But aorist or present. And hina expresses purpose. Now, does it always express purpose? No, not always, but I'm talking about what is your default starting point. Okay? Most of the time you're going to be correct if you assume that hina is a purpose clause and followed by the subjunctive. Okay? Okay. So, why had they gone into the town? For the purpose of buying some victuals, trophas, stuff to munch on, food. Okay? And then, therefore, the woman said, the Samaritan. Now, you see a difference between these two forms. Okay, so here's the pure adjective, and this is actually of Samaria, the city or the geographic marker. But here, Samarites, the adjective. So here, the Samaritan woman. Okay, and notice we have a direct quote. We have a capital P here. How you, a Jew, being from me to drink, are asking, dash, a Samaritan, being a Samaritan woman. And here, just the side comment, for Judaioi, okay, they do not associate. Okay, now why is this dative? Well, here we have a compound verb. A lot of compound verbs take the dative, but this is really the preposition sin. Sin. Okay? Krontai. Synchrontai. We don't synchronize together. Okay? So that explains why we have the dative here. It's a dative of association, that they do not associate with. All right. John's epistles show a strong indictment of docetism. Little remarks such as this rebut the notion that Jesus only seemed to be human. Okay, so this is a Christological, theological point, that he was thirsty. And you say, well, what's the great theology in him being thirsty? Well, in the first 2 centuries, already lurking around the New Testament, in the later days of John, there was a movement called docetism. It comes from the verb dokeo, that he just seemed to be a human being. Now, part of that was because of Platonic philosophy, which despises the material body, and it was just considered completely unworthy for the Son of God to take on human flesh. Why would God do that? Okay, so this is the foundation, a little bit of Gnosticism, which can come later, this grand effort to separate the soul from the body, because the body is material, and the body is weak, and the body is evil. Didn't Jesus himself say that the flesh counts for nothing? The spirit gives life. The flesh counts for nothing. And so this developed rather early in Christian history. But these little remarks, and John doesn't call attention to it, but they become these important theological details, that he was fully man, he sat down and he was worn out, he was tired and he asked for a drink, and his disciples are going to get some food so that he can eat. These all indicate to his full humanity. Rabbi Eliezer said, "Let no one talk with a woman in the street. No, not with one's own wife." So what Jesus was doing here was pretty radical. And when the disciples return, they're kind of shocked that he's talking with a woman. But he doesn't see her primarily as a woman. He sees her as a soul for whom he has come. Okay, I noted the rare pluperfect, and here we have hina, purpose. So there, agorasosin, there's my subjunctive. The sigma tells me that it's aorist. Okay? Last section. Apokrythe Jesus kai aipen aute, ai edais ten dorian tu theu, kai tis estin holegon soi dos moi pain, su an etesas auton, kai edoken an soi hidor zon. Lege aute hegene Kyrie, uta antlema echais, kai ta frear estin bathi, pathen uk echais ta hidor totzon. Me sumaidzon I tu patras hemon Jacob, has edoken hemin ta frear, kai autas ex autu epiein, kai ha huioi autu, kai ta thremata autu. All right. What kind of condition do we have here? Well, we have some pretty big clues here, don't we? We have an on, and we have an on, and we have an I. Okay? So, I'm going to just tell you that in the New Testament, there are no complete fourth-class conditions, meaning there are no complete future less vivids. So this is not I plus optative, optative plus on. There isn't one of those in the Greek New Testament. Okay, so we have to look for something else. Okay, think about the way you'd translate this. If you were knowing from oida, okay, here in the pluperfect, but you remember oida, you translate the perfect like a present and the pluperfect like a imperfect. Okay, you remember that from classical Greek? So if you knew the gift of God, and if you knew who is the one saying to you, give me to drink, you would ask him. Okay? Now, and he would give you. Okay? What we have here, it's not what you learned in classic as a purely form contrary to fact, but in its bare components, that's basically what it is. Okay, so you're just going to have to get used to this with the New Testament, that things aren't perfectly framed. For example, you say, well, this is I plus pluperfect on plus an aorist. I mean, and then edoken, right? Another aorist, that's fine. Dedoka is the perfect, right? But you're just going to have to get used to it. The important thing is to focus on this. This creates an element of uncertainty on. Okay? The fact is you don't know the gift of God, and the fact is you don't know who's talking to you. Okay? So now this is contrary to the fact. If you would know the gift of God, and if you would know who is talking to you, okay, you would ask. But the fact is you're not asking because you don't know. So I'm speaking contrary to fact. Okay, so that's a CTF. Okay, would you call it a past or a present? I'd call it a present contrary to fact. Okay, if you were knowing, you would. Not if you had known, you would have asked. I wouldn't translate that way like this was some past event that took place last week. No, it's happening right now, so I think you have to say it's a contrary to fact. Now, some grammars just call this a class 2 condition. Okay? Where the premise is assumed to be untrue. That's all that second class condition means. That the premise is assumed to be untrue. Like here, if you knew the gift of God. I'm assuming that's untrue. I'm assuming that you don't know the gift of God. Okay? So, hydor zone, living water. Okay, now this whole thing about living water is going to come up again and again in John's Gospel, or just the imagery of water, right? We had it in chapter 1. We had water turned into wine in chapter 2. We have more baptizing in chapter 3, and we have Nicodemus talking about being born of water, or Jesus talking to Nicodemus about being born of water and the Spirit. Okay, so, and now we have more water here, and it's living water. Okay? There are two words here used in this section for the well or the water, right? So, tafre'ar is the well itself. The well itself. And the pege is really focusing on the spring, the constant supply of fresh water. So, here am I, just a couple days after my 20th birthday, and actually the shadow of the man taking the picture here is Mark Kelpine, Professor Kelpine's brother. And this is at Sychar, and here is allegedly Jacob's well. So, we dropped rocks and timed it, and with our rudimentary math, we figured it was about 80 feet down to where we heard it splash. So the woman says the well is deep. Yes, and now Jesus talks about, no, I'm actually going to be the one to supply the water. And she says, you don't even have a bucket. How are you going to do that? Okay. You aren't greater than our father Jacob, are you? So she's expecting a no answer. It's like, who do you think you are? Okay. And then we have these details from the life of Jacob, and we have no other place in Scripture where these details are given. And so it's not to say they're wrong, but we have to admit the possibility that this may have been a local tradition. Okay? But finally, the Holy Spirit did write it down, and I'm not saying that it's wrong or false or anything. All I'm saying is it's interesting information, but we can't substantiate it with a specific piece of history from the book of Genesis. It's highly likely that if you dig a well that you're going to drink from it, and so are your animals and your servants and your whole household. So I don't have any problem with it. I'm just making the point that this is new information that we don't have in the Old Testament anywhere else. I've decided to press on with verses 13 and 14 at least. Apokrythe Jesus kai aipenaute pas hapinon ektu hidatas tuta dipsesai palan. Hostean pa, well, we want to take a look at that, don't we? Ektu hidatas hu ego doso auto u me dipsesai aiston iona ala tahidor hadoso auto genesetai en auto pege hidatus alomenu aistain ionion. Oh, we got some just beautiful forms here, don't we? And we have a lot of future forms here too as well. All right? So that helps us out in our identification of some of these things. So, hastean, pa. He who, if he should drink. Okay? So this is what we call an indefinite relative clause. Now, like hina, ean is used with the subjunctive. In fact, you don't even have a choice. Ean is never used with the optative. Okay? So ean is used with the subjunctive. But you're saying, I don't see ean, I see an. Well, look at de, right? We call that elision, right? You learned that in first year Greek. So instead of saying hos de ean, it's just hos dean. Okay, but it is an ean, and pa is a subjunctive form. Okay, so what form is this? Well, is it future subjunctive? Well, you can be the first to invent the future subjunctive in nearly 3 millennia. That's fine. But no, there is no future subjunctive, right? But he who, if he should drink from this water, what water? Which I will give, okay? So that's not the apodosis, which I will give. That's just a relative pronoun or a relative clause. So that's not the conclusion of the condition. Here's the conclusion of the condition. Okay, it's strong future negation. Okay, so basically what we have here is, now don't think of the future here as uncertain. This is very definite. There is no way he will thirst again forever. Absolutely no way. Okay, ume dipsezai. Okay, Isaiah talks about the wells of salvation, right? Therefore you will draw water, therefore you will, rejoicing, draw water from the wells of salvation, right? And on that day you will say, give thanks to the Lord and call upon his name. All right, he who should he drink. Okay, now that's where the uncertainty lies, is that not everyone, because of their sinful nature, will drink of this water. Okay? So it's not that God isn't not being uncertain that he doesn't want people to drink from it. No, that's not the point. The point is, Jesus recognizes the fact that human nature has this incredible and bad ability to reject what God is freely trying to give. Okay? Which I will give to him. There is absolutely no way he will ever be thirsty again forever. It's incredibly comforting that, it's like the 23rd Psalm, right? He satisfies my soul with good things. Now, the relative pronoun here, who, I've also pointed out in green, really shouldn't be a genitive. But here we have one of those instances where it is attracted to the noun to which it relates. Okay? It really should be an accusative, shouldn't it? It should be hun, right? And the water which I will give it to him. It should be an accusative direct object, but it's attracted to the case of the noun it modifies. This is genitive, and so this relative pronoun just goes into the genitive case to show you. It just ties the knot a little tighter between these two words. Okay, but to emphasize, this is not the conclusion to this condition right here. Okay, this is the conclusion. Okay, so the condition is, he who, if he should drink, he will never thirst. There is no way he will thirst. Dipsezai, okay, forever, for all eternity. It is an emphatic. Here it's used with the not the aorist subjunctive, but just the future indicative. Dipsezai, future indicative, right? So, not the subjunctive, ume dipsai or something like that, but ume dipsezai, the future, indicating an amount of certainty about the future. Okay? That if this should happen, this most definitely will happen, right? That there is no way he will thirst again. All right, with that, I'm going to bring this session to a close. It's a long video, but I'm just trying to keep us on pace while the Lord heals me and gets me in a position to return to the classroom. Again, I thank you for your understanding, and I pray that this was beneficial to you, useful. Keep plugging away at the Greek. I see a number of you have tackled the article already on spirit and truth, and that's good. Okay, so bring your questions that you want clarified to class and make note of them in your notes, and we'll make sure to get them answered. All right. Khaira.